Are Vietnam and the US in talks over an historic F-16 fighter jet deal? According to US defense site 1945, at least 24 fighter jets could be part of negotiations. If agreed, this would represent the largest defense deal in history between the two former enemies. Meanwhile, two Japanese minesweepers have become the first foreign warships, other than those from China, to dock at Cambodia's Ream Naval Base. The US suspects China-renovated Ream of being an overseas Chinese base, which Cambodia denies. The arrival of the Japanese vessels was a day after Xi Jinping left the region following his charm offensive in Cambodia and Vietnam. How are Phnom Penh and Hanoi navigating current tensions between China and the United States? And how narrow is the tightrope both Asian countries are walking? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Khvat. Joining us today are Vincent Chao, DPP Taipei City Councillor and former political head of Taiwan's de facto embassy in Washington, D.C., and Sana Hashmi, Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation postdoctoral fellow. A warm welcome to both of you on the show today. Let's talk F-16s first. US defense news outlet 1945 says its story was based on, quote, multiple sources, including a former US government official with knowledge of the negotiations and multiple US defense industry representatives. Vincent, let me come to you first. What's your read on this story?
So it's an interesting buy because traditionally we've seen Vietnam almost exclusively sourced from Russia. I mean, all of their fighter jets, I think almost without exception, are from the Russia or the Soviet Union. And so this choice on F-16, it has economic consequences, it has geographical considerations. Let me just quickly say the economic component. I'm not convinced when people say that this is an effort to shore up the trade surplus that they have. I mean, the trade surplus they have is humongous. It's huge. It's over $120 billion.
Yeah, let me just quote Bill Hayton, who's a Vietnam expert, as we know. This is a great way for Vietnam to look like it's trying to reduce its trade surplus with the US. I doubt if it will ever happen, though.
Yeah, I mean, we buy F-16Vs as well. And the per unit cost, including maintenance and some of the other selections that we've made, is about $100 million each. And so if they're looking at maybe a 24 fighter jet buy, that's just over $2 billion. It's not a whole lot of money compared to $120 billion in terms of their trade surplus. But I do think it's an effort to build goodwill and to show the U.S. that it is making efforts on a security, on economic front to align themselves more closely with the U.S.
Right. Sana, why would Vietnam need the F-16s in the first place? You know, why would these warplanes, or what would they deter or defend against?
I think China is the reason. China is the answer. China has been a threat for Vietnam, for Philippines, and Vietnam has been also asking for BrahMos from India. So, of course, it's one of the reasons is also that they have to diversify their defense purchases. Russia is, of course, not the most viable country as of now. So definitely, I think the US is on top of the list, and they have to defend themselves against China. If not defending, at least they have to deter themselves.
Right. So that's what we're talking about, Vincent, in terms of the South China Sea, the Paracel Islands, the claims over this territory.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I think Vietnam, does face a choice. And I think, to be honest, I think they've already chosen, which is that strategically, in terms of security, they're going to align themselves closer with the United States. And that's purely based on, I think, the challenge that they realize China poses, not only in the South China Sea, but also in the border regions that they have with China. And so if you look at the past, Vietnam has been always very, very careful. I mean, economically, China is still their most important trading partner. But I think in terms of security, they no longer feel that they can rely so much on China's claims that they just want peace, that they have no overt territorial ambitions, either in the South China Sea or in the Southeast Asia region. And so I think Vietnam has seen that, well, this is the writing on the wall, so let's get started. But I do think that they face a lot of monumental issues working with the Trump administration, mainly because of that trade surplus. I mean, this again, I have to emphasize, there's very, very little Vietnam can do at this point to eradicate, much less reduce that trade surplus.
We also have to say that a large part of that deficit on the US side is actually to do with China using Vietnam as a backdoor. So why the pessimism on the side of some commentators like Bill Hayton then? We talked about, you know, the challenge or the threat from China. The negotiations have been going on for a long time. So why this, I doubt, if it will ever happen?
People are right to be skeptical because, again, this is something Vietnam has never done in the past. They focused on, Su-30s, Su-22s. They source a lot from Russia. So this would be pretty monumental. But I think people would have real doubts and questions whether this is kind of a one-time thing in terms of let's throw this out there to start gain some leverage in this trade and economic discussions they're having with the U.S., or this is actually a sustained transition in terms of how they want to source. Because it's not just about buying fighter jets. I mean, we have to understand the maintenance, the parts, training, personnel, the ecosystem. All of that takes a lot of time. And if you're 80% focused on the Russian sourcing, then a shift to F-16, that's going to be pretty monumental. So I think people are right to be somewhat skeptical at this point.
That's interesting. Let's hold that thought. We're going to discuss that a little bit later. Let's turn to China. So what kind of response, Sana, would you expect from Beijing, which in April condemned the sale of 20 F-16s to the Philippines? Take a look.
菲律宾同其他国家开展的任何防务安全合作，都不应该针对第三方，或者损害第三方的利益，更不能威胁地区的和平与安全，加剧地区的紧张。当前，究竟是谁在拱火浇油？是谁在挑动军事对抗？是谁在把亚洲变成火药桶？相信地区国家都看得清清楚楚。
So, Sana, what do you expect Beijing to do about this? We've talked about the significance, the political significance of any such deal.
As in, China has always been protesting, no matter even if there is U.S. presence in the region. I think what China does is to just protest. And I think this has been one of the main objectives for China, to keep the U.S. out of the region and make Southeast Asia a sphere of influence of China. So I think even I want to go back to the skepticism with respect to the deal happening or not happening. It's also because I don't think it's about China. I don't think it's about Vietnam. I think it's more about the U.S. commitment to the region. And then we talk about trade surplus, we talk about economic security, we talk about strategic interest, but then is U.S. really very serious about being the most important player in the region and being the security guarantor that the countries in the region need. But then when it comes to China, China also knows that the policy of these countries is hedging. As in this is their best bet. They cannot just rely on Russia, they cannot just rely on China. They also have to get extra territorial powers such as the U.S. So I think this has been the defining feature of the region. So I don't really, of course, China has been the core behind the deal, behind these countries going for defense cooperation with countries such as India, with Japan, with even Russia for that matter. So as in, I don't think that China's response is going to be any different than what we have seen in the past.
So just more of the same. Vincent, I can't let the clip that we just saw from Guo Jiakun go without you giving me some comment, especially the very last sentence. So what was said was, I believe all countries in the region know exactly who is fanning the flames, fueling military confrontation, and turning Asia into a power keg. Can I get your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is one of the few comments I actually agree with him on. I don't see where the problem is. I mean, people absolutely, I think, have an idea who is fanning the flames of military adventures and who is stoking military tensions in the region. And I think people have a consensus that's China. I mean, China is doing so in the South China Sea. They've done so just recently. They're continuing to engage in expansionism across the Pacific. We're going to talk about Cambodia in a little bit, what they're doing there. And of course, there's Taiwan Strait. I mean, so when Vietnam, and they're thinking really in terms of, I mean, I imagine Vietnam wants to focus on their economic growth. I mean, they have a lot of people they need to pull out of poverty, to want to bring a lot of people into the middle class. I mean, they're building themselves into a manufacturing superpower. I mean, I'm sure Vietnam wants to focus on economic aspects. They can't. We can't. We have to focus on security aspects because we do face a common challenger in the region, and that's China. And so I think the F-16s, I explained that, I can see where people like Bill Hayden come from in terms of their skepticism. I think ultimately, I believe that it's going to follow through for a simple reason that it makes long-term sense for Vietnam to do so.
Okay. Now, the F-16 fighting Falcon or Viper is considered the driving force behind the US's modern Air Force.
It's a legend in aviation history. Born from dogfight theories and Cold War tensions, this American multirole jet has been the backbone of air forces across the globe for nearly 5 decades.
The dogfights were primarily those during the Vietnam War and the U.S. Air Force's inability with their F-4 Phantoms to beat Vietnam's MiG-21s. Out of this, Colonel John Boyd and defense analyst Thomas Christie developed the energy maneuverability theory based on agility, thrust-to-weight ratio, and lightweight design. From these beginnings, the F-16 emerged. If a deal is struck 5 decades since the end of the Vietnam War, F-16s could be headed to the very nation that gave birth to this modern fighter. So, Sana, let's talk about the symbolism of that. You know, we all know that the Vietnam War was very long and very bitter, and it was only 50 years away. And it was only 50 years ago.
So I feel that, of course, you know, there is this lingering resentment, and specifically when we talk about U.S. presence in Vietnam, U.S. cooperation with Vietnam. But then we also have to talk about the war that happened between China and Vietnam in 1979. And that was on the basis of the regional power dynamics and the struggle for their sovereignty of the countries in the region. It wasn't just about Vietnam. The very basis was the territorial sovereignty. And now Philippines, the South China Sea, you know, the countries are dealing with a common challenge. So I think, of course, even though there is this lingering resentment with respect to the U.S. and there is this distrust, and, you know, they have a reason to doubt the U.S. The pivot to Asia, Indo-Pacific, and now the Donald Trump erratic policies that these countries are dealing with right now. So, of course, you know, with F-16 and other perhaps agreements and cooperation avenues, U.S. might also try to establish network security cooperation, establish itself as a country that could be perhaps seen again as a security provider. But I think when it comes to the past, when it comes to the experiences, I do believe that China is absolutely seen as a current security threat. So I think, of course, the past ideological differences do have an impact. But right now, I think it's more about survival. It's more about the security tensions that these countries are dealing with.
Vincent, you spoke about, you know, this isn't just a one-off deal to purchase 24 fighter jets. It's also essentially a long-term investment because of the maintenance and the parts and everything. And you talked about how essentially it would be a turning point, a very significant one. What do you think, looking at it from Washington's point of view, what are their goals behind this deal if it were to go through?
There's a reason why so many U.S. partners and allies in the region, including us, use F-16s. I mean, we have one of the largest F-16 fleets anywhere in the world. So I do think that obviously there's an industrial aspect, but more importantly, there's an alignment aspect of it from the United States. Like, look, all of our partners and allies, to some degree, use U.S. armaments in this region from the U.S. perspective. And if we can bring Vietnam into that fold and tie them into this long-term strategic alignment, I think it's going to be, I think it's going to fulfill exactly what, you know, not only the Trump administration, number one, has set out to do, but also Biden has set out to do, which is to bring regional partners and allies in sharper alignment on China.
So in terms of that alignment, I mean, we are talking about essentially the whole of the First Island chain.
Right.
Right. And in bringing in Vietnam, then we're also talking about the South China Sea, isn't it?
And let me put it more bluntly. So, like, U.S.-built F-16s will never be used against U.S. interests. That's just how armaments work. I mean, we saw that play out in Ukraine when countries could just switch things off and say, this does not fulfill our export licensing, does not fulfill, you know, our interest in this, and therefore, you know, even though you bought this weapon, you know, you're not going to be able to use it. And so the choice of F-16s means that not only does Vietnam believe that this will never be used against U.S. interests, but the U.S. also believes that Vietnam will now never use its future weapons against U.S. interests. So I think it is a good move from the U.S. side. And in fact, if I had to, you know, if I could be a part of that decision-making campaign, I can. But I would sell it to Vietnam for cheap. Like, I wouldn't try to gain an industrial economic advantage out of it, because just tying them into this U.S.-built ecosystem, I mean, that's more valuable than $2.4 billion or however amount Vietnam chooses to pay for its F-16s.
Sana, turning it the other way, Vincent just said very clear that these F-16s wouldn't be used against U.S. interests. Obviously, we know that Vietnam purchasing them would mean greater interoperability between the air forces and therefore the militaries of Vietnam and the U.S. And leading on from that, I suppose, is also the possibility to fight together. So could we see a scenario in the future in which Vietnam could be relied on in that way?
I think we have to first segregate, are we talking about South China Sea or are we talking about Taiwan? Of course, Vietnam is a party to the South China Sea, and what it would want perhaps US presence or other countries' presence more in the region. And if we just talk about this deal and more cooperation, of course, this is to deter, build their own deterrence against China. But then we also have to be very, very clear that Vietnam doesn't want to fight the Chinese, be it in the South China Sea, or I don't think we can even talk about Taiwan. Because even if you just go back to the recent past when Xi Jinping was visiting Vietnam, the optics was so successful, specifically from the Chinese perspective. And this was his first ever, Xi Jinping's first ever visit this year to the region. So this entire idea that, Vietnam and China are brothers and they have to stick together, so that also came from Vietnam. So this hedging diplomacy is something that we are definitely seeing specifically from Vietnam's side, despite being a party in the South China Sea. So, we have countries such as Philippines, then we have countries such as Vietnam, totally different approaches with respect to the South China Sea.
And I just want to add, I mean, Sana raises a very, very salient point, which is I don't think anybody, including the United States, realistically expects Vietnam to have a role to play in a Taiwan contingency scenario. I think it's more about strategic alignment, more about building interoperability with partners and allies, more about sort of reinforcing American leadership in the region rather than focusing on any specific front. Now, the South China Sea, like Sana said, is obviously a little bit different, and Vietnam does have a very, very real interest there, sovereign interest in many senses. And so building that and bridging that capability gap with Vietnam being able to protect some of their sovereign interests there, I think is also a priority. But I would think very little of that would relate directly to Taiwan.
Okay, so we're talking more about US influence and supporting a US-led order. Long-running China-funded renovations at Cambodia's Ream Naval Base were completed and the base opened on April 5th. You can see here the official plaque at the base with Cambodian and Chinese flags. On the right with white hair is former Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin, now ambassador to Cambodia. There's also a display of the renovations that enable larger ships and a dry dock for ship repairs. At the event, Hun Manet pushed back at suggestions the base was a Chinese outpost. Watch.
Cambodia រដ្ឋាភិបាលដឹកនាំដោយគណៈបព្វជិជនគ្មានគោលបំណងថ្ងៃមុនអតីតកាលថ្ងៃនេះឬថ្ងៃមុខនៅក្នុងការរំលោភអធិរដ្ឋធម្មនុញ្ញរបស់ខ្លួនតាមរយៈការឲ្យប្រទេសណាកងទ័ពតាមមកដាក់មូលដ្ឋានកងទ័ពផ្ដាច់មុខនៅលើទឹកដីកម្ពុជានោះទេនឹងចាប់ផ្ដើមពីថ្ងៃនេះទៅកម្ពុជានឹងស្វាគមន៍នៅភាគីមិត្តទាំងអស់ដែលមកវឹកវើរួមគ្នានៅមូលដ្ឋានយោធាយើងគ្មានអីចាក់នេះទេ
Then, a day after she visited Cambodia, 2 Japanese minesweepers, the Bungo and the Etajima, docked at the base. Sana, let me come to you next. So Cambodia says it's nothing to hide, and Japanese ships were allowed to dock to prove this. So does this help to ease US concerns?
I think US is not really as much focused on the region. I don't really see any policy where they're actually focused on what is China doing in the Southeast Asian region, and specifically with Cambodia. And, I think when it comes to countries such as Cambodia, Laos, I think US and other countries had already given up. And now we are seeing countries such as Japan, India, they're actually reaching out to countries where China has a strong presence. And even if you look at Laos, the entire railway system is now by the Chinese. I just read somewhere someone posted that, we have to go to Laos before it becomes a Chinese colony. So, all these countries already have strong Chinese presence. So if Japan is increasing its presence, it's a good development, but I don't think it's something that would ease tension or make it better for countries such as US or even India, who's actually invested in strengthening their cooperation with countries such as Cambodia and Laos.
Vincent, before we get any further, let's deal with why would China want either control or preferential access over this particular base? I mean, what are those US concerns based on?
Yeah, well, that's the multi-billion-dollar question, right? Because China is not an altruistic organization. I mean, they're going to do things that are in their best interest, and certainly funding a major expansion of a naval port in Cambodia on the Gulf of Thailand. I mean, that's very consistent with power projection. That's consistent with One Belt, One Road. It's consistent with being able to deter, I think, other partners, our partners from the region. I guess if you look at how Southeast Asian countries are dealing with the China issue, it's also a major destabilizing action in terms of ASEAN unity on issues like the South China Sea. So Cambodia working with China on this funding this naval expansion, of course, it's going to raise eyebrows in the West. Of course, it's going to lead to concerns in the United States. They're looking for what happens when push comes to shove. What happens when a contingency arises? What happens when countries like Cambodia must make decisions about allowing people and disallowing others? And what choice is Cambodia going to make then? And for many, I think the signal by building this base is that Cambodia is going to choose China.
So what scenarios are you referring to there?
No, I'm referring to a contingency scenario, either across the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea, when China sees foreign vessels, particularly U.S. vessels, as an active security threat. What is Cambodia going to do? And I think on this point particularly, I think it reinforces the conclusions that many people have already drawn, which is that Cambodia is going to choose China.
Also, I want to add a point, as in when it comes to Ream Base, as in we all know that it's very far from the South China Sea and also for Taiwan. It could just act as a staging ground, and perhaps I think it's more about projecting power. It's more about pushing U.S. out of the region and have Chinese presence, military presence more increase. So I think it's more about power projection than actually using bases in Cambodia.
So that's where you two disagree slightly on that point. Sana, I want to stay on you. What did you make of the choice of Japan then as the first foreign, other than China, navy to dock here?
I think
is that aimed at the U.S.?
We could say that, but I think more than that, Japan's policy has also been independent and has been kind of that of outreach. Japan has been one of the oldest countries that have been giving the development assistance, and Cambodia has also been on the list. So I think now it's also trying to expand its role in the region. It's also trying to expand the areas of cooperation from economics to security and now also to defense. So as in, it's since Vincent mentioned about Chinese formidable presence in Cambodia, I think it's definitely a welcoming development that a country such as Japan is being welcome in Cambodia. So I think it also tells us that even though Chinese presence in Cambodia and the cooperation is so formidable, but despite that, a country like Japan is welcome. So there is, of course, when we talk about Minesweeper, it's not something that's path-breaking. But then I think it's a start of something perhaps some countries could take cue and increase their presence in other countries in Southeast Asian region.
Vincent, I just want to ask you, but at the same time, of course, Japan is a staunch US ally. Do you see this as an attempt, almost like the F-16s deal, to soften relations with the US directly after the visit by Xi Jinping?
Yeah, I'm doubtful. I mean, Cambodia is going to invite Japan because the optics look good and because it shows what they've been trying to say, which is that we're open to everybody and that all ships below 20,000 tons are welcome to dock. And Japan's not going to say no. I mean, Japan does have, like Sana said, a good relationship with Cambodia. They do have a long-standing relationship there, and so Japan's going to say yes, and they're going to find ways to build that relationship again.
Some analysts believe Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet is pursuing a strategy to diversify his country's foreign policy and reduce over-reliance on China. Educated at the US's top military academy, West Point, Hun Manet replaced his father Hun Sen, the country's longest-serving leader who ruled for nearly 4 decades, up to 2023. Previously, under Hun Sen, China was, quote, Cambodia's most important patron, and Cambodia became known as not only China's Belt and Road showcase country, but also China's most loyal ally in Southeast Asia. Sana, let me come to you. So how deep does any shift by Hun Manet go, do you think, if indeed he is really trying to diversify foreign policy?
I don't think we should read too much into it, because it's just not about what China is doing. It's also about what other countries are doing to reach out to Cambodia. As in, Cambodia has always been at the lower tier of any country's priorities, specifically when it comes to the ASEAN region. So just because China has been reaching out to Cambodia for decades, this is not something that's new. So I do believe that it's on, even if countries in the region are trying to diversify, they have been trying to diversify, and I think this is the policy specifically of the major countries in the region, that we have to protect our national interests, but also we cannot be reliant on one single major country. So that was the policy, that was the approach of most of the countries, and perhaps Cambodia is also realizing that ASEAN centrality is something that perhaps Cambodia also has to focus on. But then I think just these are isolated small developments. So I think we have to wait and see how and if this diversification of partnership is actually happening from Cambodia's side. So as in, I'm not very optimistic about it, because China's influence is something that is unbeatable at the moment. We do not really have a lot of initiative from other countries. Biden couldn't even go to Cambodia or any other smaller countries in the region. So we have to see if Trump is interested in reaching out to these countries. I don't really see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah. Vincent, last question. So on his tour of Cambodia, Xi Jinping agreed to continue the funding to the Funan-Teco Canal. This is 150 kilometers. It essentially connects Phnom Penh to the Gulf of Thailand. It was in limbo. It was stopped because there didn't appear to be any funding. Why has that come through now, do you think?
Well, I mean, a lot of things have come through now. Just a couple months ago, I think in September last year, China also agreed to provide Cambodia with 2 naval vessels. I mean, China clearly sees an opening in Cambodia. And that opening, I mean, it's not by chance. Obviously, they've had a historical relationship. When Cambodia fought a war with Vietnam, China sided with the Khmer Rouge, and they've had a very strategic, close relationship since. So I think that China does see that Cambodia has a venue to do a couple of things. Number one, to make it difficult for ASEAN countries to achieve a consensus on China and the South China Sea, number one. Number two, to continue to drive economic and trade interests through the Belt and Road project in terms of making Cambodia into this model Belt and Road project initiative. And the third one is to expand their strategic considerations in the region, particularly by funding this Ream Naval Base. And so as a result, I'm personally quite skeptical in terms of what countries like the U.S. and others can achieve.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you, Vincent Chao and Sana Hashmi, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.